What if I told you that some of the most powerful women in history were walking genetic time bombs? Their very existence a testament to humanity's most dangerous obsession with purity. What if the crowns they wore weren't just symbols of power, but monuments to centuries of calculated genetic manipulation that would make modern scientists recoil in horror? Today, we're diving deep into the twisted world of royal inbreeding, where bloodlines became death sentences and family trees looked more like genetic pretzels than actual trees. From ancient Egyptian queens who married their own brothers to modern cases that will absolutely blow your mind, we're counting down the 10 most inbred women in human history. And trust me when I say, the #1 spot will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about royal power. But before we get started, let me set the stage for what we're about to uncover together. For thousands of years, royal families across the globe made a devil's bargain, trading genetic health for political power, creating bloodlines so tightly wound that they became genetic disasters waiting to happen. These weren't isolated incidents or accidents of history. These were calculated, deliberate strategies that turned human beings into living experiments in genetic manipulation. The women we're about to discuss weren't just victims of their circumstances. They were the ultimate products of humanity's most twisted pursuit of perfection, and their stories will haunt you long after this video ends. Starting at number 10, we have Marie-Louise of Austria, a woman whose very existence reads like a cautionary tale about the dangers of keeping bloodlines too close to home. Born into one of Europe's most deeply entangled dynasties, Marie-Louise's life began with genetic cards stacked so heavily against her that modern geneticists would be absolutely horrified by what her family tree looked like. Her parents weren't just related, they were double first cousins, meaning they shared both sets of grandparents, creating a genetic compression so severe that Marie-Louise had only 4 unique great-grandparents instead of the normal 8 that every human being should have. Think about that for a moment. While you and I have 8 different great-grandparents contributing to our genetic makeup, Marie-Louise had half that number, meaning her genetic diversity was compressed to a level typically seen only in isolated island populations or extreme cases of inbreeding. Of the 12 children born to her parents, only 7 managed to survive to adulthood, a mortality rate that speaks volumes about the genetic cost of their family's obsession with bloodline purity. But Marie-Louise's story doesn't end with her tragic birth circumstances, because at 18 years old, she was married off to Napoleon Bonaparte himself as part of a political strategy designed to secure peace and produce a male heir for the French Empire. The irony here is absolutely staggering. Napoleon, one of history's most powerful military leaders, was essentially handed a genetically compromised bride in the hopes that she could produce strong heirs for his empire. Marie-Louise's marriage to Napoleon wasn't about love or even political alliance in the traditional sense. It was about using her Habsburg bloodline, damaged as it was, to legitimize Napoleon's rule and create a dynasty that could bridge the gap between old European nobility and new French power. Her life became a perfect example of how royal women were treated as genetic commodities, their value measured not by their intelligence, skills, or desires, but by their ability to carry and transmit bloodlines that had been manipulated for centuries. But if you think Marie-Louise's genetic situation was extreme, wait until you hear about number 9 on our list. Isabella II of Spain, born in 1830, was welcomed into the world as a daughter after her father's desperate hope for a male heir had been repeatedly disappointed. But Isabella's birth brought with it genetic baggage that would define not just her own life, but the entire trajectory of Spanish royal succession. She was the product of an uncle-niece union, but the genetic entanglement went far deeper than that simple description suggests. Her lineage was so tangled that her grandparents were also her great-grandparents, creating a genetic loop that defied all natural logic. At 16 years old, Isabella was married to her double second cousin, ensuring that the genetic compression continued into the next generation. Over the course of her life, she bore 11 children, but only 5 managed to survive infancy, a mortality rate that historians directly attribute to the genetic complications arising from generations of inbreeding. But here's where Isabella's story takes an even more shocking turn. Historical evidence strongly suggests that her husband, despite being her closest genetic relative, actually fathered none of the surviving children. The implications of this are absolutely mind-blowing because it means that Isabella, trapped in a marriage designed to preserve bloodline purity, was forced to seek genetic diversity outside her marriage just to produce viable offspring. Isabella eventually lost her crown, but her legacy remains forever steeped in the genetic entrapments that defined royal life in 19th century Europe. Her story perfectly illustrates how the pursuit of bloodline purity created situations so genetically unstable that even royal marriages couldn't function as intended. The very system designed to preserve royal genetics actually forced royal women to undermine that system just to produce living children, creating a web of deception and genetic manipulation that historians are still unraveling today. Moving up to number 8, we encounter Lorraine Whitaker, and this is where our journey takes a absolutely shocking turn into modern times. While most people assume that extreme inbreeding is something relegated to ancient history or distant royal families, Lorraine Whitaker proves that these genetic disasters are still happening right here, right now, in contemporary America. Featured in multiple documentaries as a case study of generational isolation and intermarriage, Lorraine represents one of the most genetically compromised individuals documented in recent memory, and her story will absolutely shatter any illusions you might have about inbreeding being a thing of the past. Lorraine's family created what researchers describe as a closed genetic loop, where multiple generations practiced intermarriage with no outside genetic input whatsoever. The results were catastrophic, creating levels of genetic similarity typically seen only in laboratory breeding experiments with animals. But Lorraine's story becomes even more heartbreaking when you learn that she is the mother of Timmy Whitaker, who researchers believe may be the most genetically affected person alive today. The documentation of Lorraine's case provides modern science with a real-world example of what happens when human breeding follows the same patterns that animal breeders use to create specific traits in livestock. What makes Lorraine's story particularly disturbing is that it happened in modern America, with access to education, medical care, and genetic counseling that could have prevented the worst outcomes. Her case proves that extreme inbreeding isn't just a historical curiosity or something that happens in isolated royal families. It's an ongoing human tragedy that continues to unfold in hidden corners of our modern world. The documentation of her family's genetic situation provides researchers with invaluable data about the long-term effects of inbreeding, but at the cost of multiple generations of human suffering that could have been prevented. At number 7, we have Maria I of Portugal, also known as Maria the Pious or Maria the Troubled, titles that perfectly capture the dual nature of her tragic existence. Born in 1734, Maria's life was marked from the very beginning by the mental strain and genetic complications that came with her close royal unions. Her parents were the 16th Iberian royal couple to be joined through close intermarriage, representing generations of genetic compression that had reached a critical breaking point by the time Maria was born. Maria's genetic situation was so precarious that she was married to her own uncle in order to maintain the family name and continue the bloodline, a decision that virtually guaranteed that her children would face even more severe genetic challenges. True to the predictions that modern genetics would make, half of Maria's children didn't survive childhood, deaths that can be directly attributed to the genetic complications arising from generations of inbreeding. But the genetic toll on Maria herself was perhaps even more devastating than the loss of her children. As Maria aged, her mental state deteriorated rapidly until she was eventually deemed unfit to rule, becoming a living example
of how royalty could be undone by the invisible toll of genetic repetition. Her descent into mental illness wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a royal crisis that threatened the stability of the entire Portuguese monarchy. Maria's story perfectly illustrates how the pursuit of bloodline purity created rulers who were genetically incapable of fulfilling their royal duties, undermining the very system that the inbreeding was supposed to preserve. The irony of Maria's situation is absolutely heartbreaking. Here was a woman born into ultimate privilege and power, given titles that emphasized her piety and devotion, but genetics condemned her to a life of mental anguish and political failure. Her story serves as a perfect example of how royal inbreeding created a contradiction at the heart of monarchy itself, where the very practices designed to preserve royal power actually created rulers who were incapable of wielding that power effectively. Number 6 brings us to Marie-Louise Elizabeth d'Orléans, whose life reads like a Gothic novel of blood and sorrow, that would be dismissed as too tragic to be believable if it weren't completely documented historical fact. Marie-Louise Elizabeth's father was forced to marry his cousin, who happened to be an illegitimate daughter of Louis XIV, creating a genetic foundation that was already compromised before Marie-Louise Elizabeth was even born. As the eldest surviving child of this genetically problematic union, she was destined to carry forward the family's genetic legacy, regardless of the personal cost. At a young age, Marie-Louise Elizabeth was married to another cousin, Prince Charles of Berry, ensuring that the genetic compression continued into yet another generation. The couple had 3 children together, but in a pattern that was becoming tragically familiar among inbred royal families, none of their children survived childhood. The repeated loss of her children drove Marie-Louise Elizabeth to seek solace in alcohol, a dependency that she developed as early as age 14, making her one of the youngest documented cases of alcoholism in royal history. Marie-Louise Elizabeth's story represents dynastic duty gone horribly wrong, where the pursuit of bloodline purity created a cycle of genetic tragedy that destroyed not just individuals, but entire family lines. Her turn to alcohol at such a young age speaks to the psychological toll of living in a system where personal happiness, health, and even basic survival were sacrificed for abstract concepts of bloodline purity and dynastic continuity. Her legacy stands as a testament to how royal inbreeding created emotional and psychological damage that extended far beyond the purely genetic consequences. The tragedy of Marie-Louise Elizabeth's life is compounded by the fact that her suffering was entirely preventable. If her family had simply married outside their immediate genetic circle, her children might have survived, her alcoholism might never have developed, and her life might have been completely different. Instead, she became another casualty in the royal obsession with genetic purity, a woman whose potential was destroyed by circumstances entirely beyond her control. At number 5, we encounter Princess Alexia of Greece, born in 1965, whose story bridges the gap between historical royal inbreeding and modern genetic awareness. What makes Alexia's case particularly fascinating is that her story unfolds in the modern era, when genetic science was well established and the dangers of inbreeding were clearly understood, yet royal tradition still trumped scientific knowledge when it came to marriage decisions. Princess Alexia's parents were related in not one, but 2 different ways, being both second cousins and third cousins simultaneously, creating what geneticists call a double bond that dramatically increases the likelihood of genetic complications. The genetic entanglement in her family tree was so complex that Constantine's great-grandparents were siblings, and one of her grandmothers was also the sister of her great-grandfather, creating loops within loops in what should have been a straightforward family tree. What makes Alexia's story particularly significant is that she and her siblings were born with levels of genetic similarity comparable to British royals Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, meaning that even in the 1960s, royal families were still producing children with genetic profiles that would be considered problematic by modern standards. Alexia represents a modern royal tale that remains firmly rooted in ancient traditions, proving that even in the face of scientific knowledge about genetics, royal families continue to prioritize bloodline preservation over genetic health. The fact that Princess Alexia was born in 1965 makes her story particularly poignant because it demonstrates that royal inbreeding wasn't just a historical practice that ended with increased scientific knowledge. Instead, it shows that royal families continued to make genetic compromises well into the modern era, essentially using their own children as experiments in bloodline preservation, even when they knew the potential consequences. Alexia's story proves that the fading royal marriage traditions died hard, and that some royal families were willing to risk genetic complications rather than abandon centuries-old practices of intermarriage. Number 4 takes us to Maria Antonia of Austria, a woman who surpassed even the infamous Charles II of Spain in terms of inbreeding levels, an achievement that should be absolutely impossible given how genetically compromised Charles was known to be. Maria Antonia's family tree has been described by geneticists not as a tree at all, but as a dense looping vine where branches curve back on themselves in patterns that defy natural logic. Her lineage was so genetically compressed that researchers refer to it as a genetic circle, rather than a traditional family lineage. The level of genetic similarity in Maria Antonia's bloodline was so extreme that it matched what you would expect to see in a child born to 2 full siblings, representing perhaps the ultimate expression of royal inbreeding taken to its logical conclusion. What makes Maria Antonia's case particularly tragic is that despite standing at the absolute peak of Habsburg inbreeding, she has been largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by her more famous relatives who were actually less genetically compromised than she was. Maria Antonia's story illustrates how extreme inbreeding could create individuals who were so genetically unusual that they
oddly represented evolutionary dead ends, people whose genetic makeup was so compressed and repetitive that they had virtually no chance of producing healthy offspring. Her existence proves that royal families were willing to push the boundaries of human genetics to absolutely unprecedented levels in their pursuit of bloodline purity, creating individuals who were more genetic curiosities than viable human beings. The fact that Maria Antonia has been largely forgotten by history, despite being more inbred than much more famous figures, speaks to how royal families managed their public image even when dealing with extreme genetic complications. It's likely that her genetic situation was so obviously problematic that the family deliberately minimized her public profile to avoid drawing attention to the consequences of their breeding practices. At number 3, we encounter mummies 317A and 317B, the infant daughters of Pharaoh Tutenkamun and Queen Ankhesenamun, dating back to approximately 1300 BCE. These two tiny mummies represent one of the most heartbreaking examples of how royal inbreeding affected the most innocent victims, children who paid the ultimate price for their parents' genetic legacy. Ankhesenamun was Tutenkamun's half-sister, sharing the same father, which meant that their children were the products of sibling marriage, a practice that was not only accepted but encouraged in ancient Egyptian royal families as a way of maintaining divine bloodlines. Tutenkamun himself was already the product of tightly confined bloodlines, meaning that his daughters inherited genetic complications from multiple generations of inbreeding within the Egyptian royal family. The short lives of these infant daughters were marked by severe deformities and frailty that made survival impossible, serving as a heartbreaking reminder that even divine kings couldn't escape the biological consequences of inbreeding. Modern analysis of these mummies has revealed genetic abnormalities that directly correlate with the kind of complications expected from sibling marriages, providing scientific confirmation of what ancient Egyptian records had already documented. What makes this case particularly poignant is that Tutenkamun and Ankhesenamun were themselves young people, probably teenagers, who were following royal traditions that had been established long before they were born. They weren't making conscious decisions to harm their children. They were participating in a system of royal marriage that had been practiced for generations and was considered not just acceptable, but religiously necessary for maintaining the divine nature of Egyptian kingship. The tragic fate of these infant daughters serves as a powerful reminder that royal inbreeding wasn't just an abstract genetic concept. It was a practice that created real human suffering, destroying the lives of innocent children who had no choice in the circumstances of their birth. Their mummified remains stand as silent testimony to the human cost of pursuing genetic purity, a cost that was paid by the most vulnerable members of royal families. Number 2 brings us to Kimberly Colt, whose story represents perhaps the most disturbing modern case of extreme inbreeding documented in recent history. In the early 2000s, Australian authorities discovered a family living in deep isolation that had been practicing multi-generational inbreeding for decades, creating what researchers describe as a closed-loop community with absolutely no outside genetic input whatsoever. The Colt family's situation was so extreme that it led to police investigations and arrests when authorities finally discovered the extent of the genetic manipulation that had been taking place over multiple generations. Kimberly was documented as one of the most genetically compromised individuals ever studied by modern science, representing a real-world example of what happens when human breeding follows the same patterns used in laboratory animal experiments. What makes Kimberly's case particularly disturbing is that it happened in modern Australia, a developed country with access to education, medical care, and genetic counseling that should have prevented such extreme genetic compression. The family's isolation was so complete that they essentially created their own genetic island, where the same genetic material was recycled over and over again until the individuals produced were barely viable as human beings. The documentation of Kimberly's case provides modern geneticists with invaluable data about the long-term effects of extreme inbreeding, but at a horrific human cost that makes this research both scientifically valuable and ethically troubling.
Her story proves that the kind of genetic manipulation that we associate with ancient royal families is still happening today, hidden away in isolated communities where lack of oversight allows these genetic disasters to unfold unchecked. Kimberly's case serves as a stark reminder that extreme inbreeding isn't just a historical curiosity, it's an ongoing human tragedy that continues to create victims in the modern world. Her story bridges the gap between ancient royal practices and contemporary genetic disasters, proving that the human tendency toward genetic manipulation hasn't disappeared. It's just moved from palaces to hidden communities where it can continue unchecked. And now, we reach number 1, the most shocking case of all, Cleopatra, the second Cleopatra of ancient Egypt, whose genetic situation was so extreme that it represents the ultimate embodiment of calculated inbreeding for political power. This isn't the romanticized film version of Cleopatra that most people know. This is the real story of a woman whose entire existence was shaped by her dynasty's obsession with maintaining bloodline purity at any cost. Cleopatra II was Egyptian by rule, but her bloodline was purely Greek Macedonian, a genetic heritage that had been carefully preserved through centuries of strategic inbreeding that would make modern geneticists absolutely horrified. The Ptolemaic dynasty didn't just practice occasional intermarriage, they relentlessly pursued sibling and uncle-niece marriages as a deliberate strategy to maintain genetic purity, creating bloodlines so tightly wound that they defied all natural logic. Cleopatra's parents were siblings. Her grandparents were siblings. Her own siblings married each other before she eventually ruled alone, representing the genetic culmination of generations of the most tightly woven lineage in human history. She wasn't just a product of inbreeding, she was a living monument to bloodline preservation strategy taken to its absolute extreme, a human being who represented the ultimate expression of genetic manipulation in pursuit of political power. The level of genetic compression in Cleopatra's bloodline was so extreme that modern geneticists struggle to find comparable examples in human history. Her family tree, if you can even call it that, looked more like a genetic spiral, where the same genetic material was recycled over and over again through generations of calculated intermarriage. She had fewer unique ancestors than virtually any other documented human being, making her genetic makeup so compressed and repetitive that she essentially represented a genetic experiment in human form. But here's what makes Cleopatra's story absolutely mind-blowing. Despite carrying this incredible genetic burden, she became one of the most powerful and successful rulers in ancient history, wielding political influence that extended across the Mediterranean world and beyond. She managed to maintain Egyptian independence during one of the most challenging periods in ancient history, negotiating with Roman leaders and managing complex international relationships while carrying genetic baggage that should have made effective leadership impossible. Cleopatra's success as a ruler makes her story even more remarkable because it proves that extreme inbreeding doesn't just create genetic victims, it can create individuals who overcome their genetic limitations through sheer force of personality and intellect. She carried the heavy weight of calculated family ambition that stretched back through generations of Ptolemaic rulers. Yet she managed to transform that genetic burden into political power that made her one of the most famous women in human history. The irony of Cleopatra's situation is absolutely staggering. Her family's obsession with genetic purity was supposed to create divine rulers who could maintain political power through bloodline superiority, and in her case, it actually worked. Despite being perhaps the most inbred individual in human history, she became exactly what her ancestors had hoped to create through their genetic manipulation, a ruler whose power and influence extended far beyond the borders of Egypt. But Cleopatra's genetic situation also represents the ultimate expression of the human cost of pursuing bloodline purity. Every aspect of her existence was shaped by genetic decisions made by ancestors she never met, people who treated human reproduction as a political strategy rather than a natural process. Her life was simultaneously the greatest success and the most horrific example of royal inbreeding, proving both that genetic manipulation could achieve its intended goals and that the human cost of those achievements was almost too terrible to comprehend. The fact that Cleopatra managed to become one of history's most successful rulers, despite her extreme genetic disadvantages, makes her story both inspiring and deeply disturbing. She represents the ultimate proof that human determination and intelligence can overcome even the most severe genetic obstacles, but also serves as a reminder of how royal families were willing to sacrifice basic human genetics in pursuit of abstract political goals. As we reach the end of our countdown, it's important to understand that these 10 women represent just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the human cost of royal inbreeding. Behind each of these documented cases lie hundreds of other individuals whose stories have been lost to history, people who paid the price for their family's genetic experiments, but whose suffering was never recorded or documented for posterity. The common thread running through all of these stories is the pursuit of purity, power, and legacy at the expense of basic human genetic health. From the majestic courts of ancient Egypt to forgotten villages in modern Australia, human beings have consistently been willing to sacrifice genetic diversity for abstract concepts of bloodline superiority, creating tragedies that span thousands of years and continue to unfold in our modern world. These women's lives were twisted into tales of tragedy, resilience, and revelation that prove history has been shaped not just by politics and war, but by the invisible forces of biology and blood that determined who could rule, who could survive, and who would be sacrificed for the sake of genetic experiments conducted on a scale that modern science would consider absolutely unethical. The legacy of these 10 women serves as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of genetic purity has always been a dangerous obsession that creates more problems than it solves. Their stories prove that royal families' historical trade-off of genetic risk for political power was a devil's bargain that created human suffering on an almost unimaginable scale, turning individual human beings into living experiments in genetic manipulation. But perhaps most importantly, these stories serve as a warning about the ongoing human tendency to treat genetics as something that can be manipulated and controlled for social or political purposes. The fact that extreme inbreeding continues to occur in modern times proves that humanity hasn't learned the lessons that these women's lives should have taught us about the dangers of pursuing genetic purity at the expense of human health and well-being. The 10 women we've discussed today represent the ultimate expression of humanity's most dangerous genetic experiments, but they also represent human resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. Despite carrying genetic burdens that should have made successful lives impossible, many of them managed to achieve remarkable things, proving that human determination can overcome even the most severe biological disadvantages. Their stories remind us that behind every royal crown and political dynasty lie real human beings who paid the price for their families' ambitions, people whose lives were shaped by genetic decisions they had no control over, but whose legacies continue to influence our understanding of genetics, power, and the human cost of pursuing perfection at any price. As we conclude this journey through history's most tragic genetic experiments, it's worth remembering that these women's stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings about the ongoing human tendency to treat genetics as a tool for achieving social and political goals. Their lives serve as powerful reminders that the pursuit of genetic purity has always been a dangerous path that creates more suffering than it prevents.